We have the dreaded right before lunch session here, but I promise we have some really great panelists who are going to keep you so engaged that you're not even going to notice your stomachs rumbling, okay? So my name is Heidi Schlumpf. I'm the national correspondent for the National Catholic Reporter. I live and work here in Chicago. I'm a journalist. I cover the more, probably you would say, progressive or liberal side of the church. That's who our readers are. But I'm really excited because I think today's panel is going to get beyond or look a little deeper beyond just those, the dichotomy of liberal and conservative, as we've talked about a little bit in panels so far. So our topic is people in practice and includes quite a bit of demographic analysis. So I thought I'd just throw out a demographic statistic I found in each of the chapters and introduction that I thought were so interesting from the book. So Andrew, who's going to go first, mentions the rise of the nuns, which is roughly at 20% of Americans now, and is expected to be up to about a third of Americans identifying as NONES, so not checking a box on religious affiliation. And then Bill expands upon that and talks about lapsed Catholics being the second largest religious group in America. So after practicing Catholics, we have some roughly 20 million lapsed, if you use that term, Catholics, or 13% of Americans. So then Southern Baptists are our third largest group. But then Tim, in his piece on Latinos, says, this stat really struck me, 1/4 of all newborns born in the United States today are Latino, and 1/5 of current school children. So we're going to hear a lot of information and analysis, and I look forward to giving a slight reaction, but I'm really interested in your questions and comments too. So Andrew, can you go first for us?
Sure. Good morning. I'm sorry I'm here and not there. The panelists seem to be beginning with confessional statements, and so that I'd say I'm a historian too, but infected by my past as a journalist. And in fact, my chapter is more of a journalistic summary of the last several decades of discussion and change about Catholic worship in the United States. And my pitch is going to be essentially that the diversity of contemporary Catholic worship in America is the clearest, the cleanest, and at least for the moment, the least controversial example of the pluriform thesis advanced in our book. The first layer of diversity is language. In most American locations, Catholic worship takes place in a large variety of languages, often 24 or more, with English and Spanish the most common, but you can find Croatian, Tongan, Tagalog, and Yoruba. There might be speaking in tongues. The cultural form or style of the Mass also provides a second layer of diversity. The music may be provided by pipe organs, mariachi bands, guitars, or rock groups. It might reflect the traditions of the Black Church, or there may be Gregorian chant. There's a third layer of ideological or theological diversity, with worship taking place either according to the revised rubrics that followed the Second Vatican Council or according to the restored Tridentine Mass. The feeling of Catholic worship can also vary enormously from setting to setting. Sunday worship among the sixth-generation descendants of Irish immigrants on Boston's South Shore seems world apart from that of recent Brazilian or Vietnamese immigrants, or of worship at a Benedictine abbey. This diversity isn't entirely comfortable, and many Catholics have been arguing about how to worship since the dramatic changes of the 1960s began to take hold. As a young reporter 40 years ago, I used to hear a lot of complaining from conservative Catholics about, quote, cafeteria Catholicism. It seems to me that over time, most Catholics have grown to like the buffet. At the moment, Catholics are largely content to find worshiping communities whose language, cultural style, and theological tone they themselves like. In most American places, there's a range of choice, and like other Americans, Catholics are choosing for themselves where and how often and how to worship. A key point is that they often choose to worship among the like-minded. So, are things flying apart? I don't think so. At least three things hold this venture together. The first is the Catholic commitment to sacramental worship. Rooted in the most ancient understandings of the Christian faith and practice, Catholics overwhelmingly accept the idea that when they attend worship, they're coming into direct contact with God and God's grace. This isn't what most Protestants think they're doing at worship. Put most directly, when Catholics receive the Eucharist, they think they're taking God into their bodies. Something comparable happens in baptism, and God's transforming grace also acts through the sacraments of penance, marriage, and ordination. Secondly, the texts of the Roman Rite remain the shared base for Catholic worship. Debates continue about issues like translation, but the base texts are stable and transmitted from Rome. Further, one of the great assertions associated with the liturgical reforms of the 20th century has taken deep root. From the early Middle Ages until 1965, most Catholics attended worship to watch the priest consecrate the host. The religious thing was visual. Participation in the sacrament was visual. In the wake of Vatican II, Catholics attend Mass to receive the Eucharist. Over time, that has changed the way Catholics build their churches and use their sacred space. That's a process that continues with much recent discussion of building churches that give dual emphasis to the Eucharist and baptism. If I had been giving this talk in 2012, I might well have struck a different tone. During the long papacy of Pope John Paul II and his successor Benedict XVI, many committed actors were struggling to blunt, modify, or even reverse the liturgical changes that swept the Church after Vatican II. Pope Benedict in particular seemed to long for the lost style and form of pre-Vatican II worship, and he enabled liturgical conservatives to return at will to worship under the Tridentine Rite, permitting the celebration of what he dubbed the ordinary form of the Mass, that is, the post-Vatican II text and rubrics, and the, quote, extraordinary, unquote, a restored version of the Tridentine Rite, the old Latin version of things. So anyone looking at Catholic discussion of worship from the late 70s through the early 21st century will find defenders and critics of Vatican II's reforms debating relentlessly at high volume and with deep emotion. The most interested parties are still yelling at each other, mostly on their own websites and publications. But two things have happened. First, the arrival of Pope Francis, a thoroughly post-Vatican II figure, while not reversing John Paul and Benedict's changes, has meant that further obligatory proven to be limited demand for a return to Tridentine Rite or worship in Latin. Some people and some clerics want it, and now they have it. But many conservatives have grown to see the advantage of the present pluralistic situation. As long as they can do what they want, they're willing to grant that others can too. It's worth noting here that not everyone gets what they want under the current dispensation, notably those who would like women to be able to take leadership roles in public worship. One final generalization is that there seems to have been a modest revival of Catholic devotional life in recent decades after a sharp drop-off in the years following Vatican II. In most places, it's not hard to find groups of Catholics praying the rosary together, attending novenas, making pilgrimages, or keeping company with the Blessed Sacrament. Devotional practices linked with identity, especially immigrant identities, are much in evidence. You can also say buy scapulars on the internet or watch the Tridentine Mass on EWTN, but only perhaps a third of current Catholics choose to make devotional practices part of their lives. So the basic burden of my message is the Catholic Church has moved in the United States to a very diverse set of practices practiced by largely groups of like-minded people. There are pluses to this, and as Katerina suggested in the last panel, there are some problems associated with that. People moving, for example, often leave their comfortable place and have to find a new comfortable place, and that can be a challenge. However, this is the picture in a religious culture where individuals make choice about what their identity will be and what their practices will be and how it will go. And the Catholic Church in its present form in the United States provides lots of choices.
So thank you, Andrew, and next we'll hear from Bill.
So thank you, kind. Can you hear me? How about like this? Okay. Not? Okay. How about this? Okay, all right, thank you. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here, and also all of the people that are responsible for this particular event at Loyola Marymount. I'm very, excuse me. Pardon me. Okay, so there's basically three things that I want to do, and what I'm doing here is I'm sort of reflecting back on this piece that I wrote as part of this collection, and having been away from it a bit of a time, and then looking at what I said and thinking about it now. And there are three things that I'd like to emphasize, and I'm going to do this somewhat informally. So the first one has to do with the fact that much of my particular piece has to do with sort of gathering together social behavioral science research that creates a certain kind of a profile of what Catholics in the United States have been like since the time of the Second Vatican Council. And there are two things that strike me about that. One is that I think it is fair to say that the dominant narrative, at least, of what's going on in the church today, certainly in the United States, has been a narrative of declension. And social science, social behavioral science research has been part of that insofar as, if you will, if you just simply look at the numbers with regard to measures of practice, belief, etc., it is a downward trajectory. Another thing that I've thought about that's kind of interesting about this is that much of this research since the Second Vatican Council has revolved around or been focused on this question of Catholic identity. Who's Catholic, who's in, who's out, what are the parameters, etc. And it just strikes me that where we are at this particular moment in time, particularly in light of the sexual abuse hierarchical malfeasance catastrophe, is that we're seeing something of a shift from who is a Catholic to why be Catholic. That's becoming a more pronounced question or pronounced issue. Another thing that interests me about this research is on Catholics since Vatican II in terms of identity issues. I basically abide by the assumption that in many ways Protestantism is prototypical of Christianity's engagement with modernity. And to the degree that Catholicism opened to modernity in a fairly dramatic way vis-a-vis Vatican II, that there are rather striking ways, and I recognize one has to be careful here, there are differences in polity and theology and what have you, but there are many ways in my mind that Catholicism is recapitulating the same kinds of things that Protestantism, and I would argue to some degree Judaism, have been through in regard to their engagement with modernity. And I think it's very, very important for us to pay attention to that in relationship to questions about the future of the church, where we're going, and so forth. The other thing with regard to this identity issue and what I see as the kind of destabilization of Catholic identity, this has to be seen in a macro context, not simply a micro context. And by micro here, I mean internally. By macro, I mean in terms of larger cultural, historical transformations that are taking place. And by this, I mean that across the industrialized world, and again, there's multiple data showing this, that people are losing interest in traditional religion. And this nun phenomena in the United States is just simply, in my mind, sort of one particularly American aspect of this, which of course is recapitulating what has happened before us in Europe with regard to the rise of the nuns. And so what I'm saying here is that it's not as though we had this incredibly vibrant church and what have you, and then all of a sudden this sexual abuse crisis came, and now we're in this kind of catastrophic, difficult situation. We have to see what's happening now in this larger gestalt of what's been going on with religion in the postmodern context. And I think that this social behavioral science research can be helpful in that regard. Okay, second kind of little pieces of this research that I want to focus on or to say something about is that we are now at a point in time relative to the Second Vatican Council in which an entire generation of social behavioral science folks who have been doing research on Catholics since Vatican II, and I include this many friends and I'm part of this generation too. I mean, we are aging, we are retiring, we are dying. And I wonder about, who will be the next generation that will take up this kind, and this is not that the first generation, that stops and then you get a new, obviously there's a crossover here. But who will these new scholars be? And more importantly, and this is a descriptive, not a normative statement, but by virtue of their age demographic, they will not be people who knew experientially the pre-Vatican II Church the way this first generation did. And secondly, they may not be enamored by Vatican II in the same way that that first generation of scholars was. In my piece, I argue that much of this research that was done, social behavioral science research on Catholics, was done by Catholic scholars, and many, in some instances, non-Catholic scholars. I think of my dear friend Dean Hoagie, who was Presbyterian, but considered himself 49% Catholic. And they were, this was, it was academic research, professional research, and so forth, but they were also committed Catholics and Catholicism has had this tortured relationship with social behavioral science research, and they wanted this to help the church, to serve the church, and so forth. And so I just wonder, with this new generation, what will their mindset be? What kind of questions will they ask in light of their life experiences, if they're Catholic, as Catholics, in terms of when they're doing their research? That's of interest to me. The third point that I'd like to make, and this is probably going to come off a little more troubling, it's this basic question of how far or what are the parameters in relationship to thinking about what it means to be Catholic that enable us to function, among other things, in the public sphere in a credible, coherent, and hopefully successful way. What are the parameters so that we are not in a situation in which we are so all over the place in terms of what we believe, what we profess, what we claim to say, and so forth, that we have effectively eviscerated the possibility of any credible impact on the culture. And this, of course, relates to this whole question of being different. And I think we have to have a long, hard discussion. This has been a leitmotif that has kind of run through all the comments that have been made here, at least as I hear them, in terms of are we talking about, one school of thought is that, Catholics today, younger Catholics, they're not any less Catholic than anybody else was. They're just Catholic in a different way. But I want to push that. Is there some point at which that difference becomes so different that it's hard, that this is going to, it's one thing for someone to say that, well, I don't buy this, don't go to Mass on Sunday, you're going to burn in hell anymore. But, I go a couple of times a month or something, I'm still connected to the liturgical life of the church. That is, if you will, to me, kind of a difference, okay? It reflects on the church's disciplinary authority, but it is a different. That's very different to me than somebody that is saying, either verbally or by their actions, that, I'm just as Catholic as you, but this liturgy stuff, I don't buy that. That doesn't really interest me. I don't see that as being constituent of what it means to be Catholic. And I can tell you, if you look closely at this, at a lot of this, you can see these kinds of things where what could have, at least historically, been argued was, in point of fact, constituent to who we are as a people of faith, has either evaporated or, and to me that goes beyond the question of difference. And I think we need a responsible discussion of this. And what's happened is that this has been left to the Catholic right, if you will, to talk about these issues of doctrine and fidelity and what have you. This also, I think, part of the problematic here is the dynamic of postmodern culture, in which, among other things, one of the cardinal sins, particularly for those of us that consider ourselves more enlightened and what have you, is to be perceived as, quote, being judgmental or being intolerant. I mean, this is a cardinal sin in a postmodern context. And I think that as Catholics, some of us have sort of got caught up in that. So you see where I'm going here? Okay, thank you. Sure, yeah.
I think one of the last speakers, so I want to also, though, add my thanks. Patricia, it was a great accomplishment to bring this book to... Oh. Patricia, it was a great accomplishment to bring the book home, Mark, and Andrew as well. Thank you all very much, and thanks to everyone for putting this together and funding it. So a little bit about Latino and Latina Catholics. Some preliminary remarks. First, these were the first Catholics that lived in what's now the United States. They've been here twice as long as the nation has existed, if you count Puerto Rico, which we should. They're also the largest recent group of immigrants. So they're not all immigrants. In fact, most Latinos are not immigrants. And we're talking about a large group that's been here a very, very long time. That's just a conceptual point that's often missed. It's very obvious, but very, very important. Also, of course, they're a diverse group. The word Latinx or Latina, Latino, describes people from at least 22 different countries. We are the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world in terms of number of speakers. But the people that are here come from all of those countries and their descendants. So it's a kind of an umbrella term. And a Cuban who goes to Chile is a foreigner. In the same way, if we went to Australia, we might speak the language, but right away would be recognized as being from somewhere else. We use that general term here to speak of all Latinos, but of course among themselves the differences are noted. However, once they get to this country, common prejudices they endure, common language, a certain degree of cultural affinity leads them to kind of band together, even though in their home countries they might see one another as being from another country. So those are just a few of the kind of backgrounds of what is this group that we're talking about, Latinos. So I want to talk on two issues of how Latinos transform the church in the United States. And I mean transform the church not just for themselves, but for many other Catholics as well. The first is shared parishes. So think of this. 100 years ago, 2/3 of the parishes in the United States were serving immigrant groups. And they were more or less ethnic national parishes. It was never quite as airtight as we sometimes are led to believe. But of course, we're sitting here in Chicago. We need not talk too length of this. You got Irish, German, Polish parishes. Chicago's made older people in Chicago still identify where they come from by the parish they were from. So 2/3 of the parishes were these ethnic parishes. Today, more than 1/3 of parishes in the United States regularly have Mass in 2 or more languages. There's different names for this. Some have called them shared parishes. I think that's a good way of speaking about it. But the reality is 1/3, and the growing number of parishes, are those that have Mass in 2 or more languages. This is a huge shift in what happens in Catholicism. Most people experience Catholicism at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. Their impression of the church is not from stuff, I'm sorry to say, even the books that great scholars write, like Bill and others, their impression of the Catholic Church is what they saw at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. And 100 years ago, what they saw is fellow Italians, fellow Irish, fellow Germans, sitting in the same pew, speaking the same language, often from the same neighborhood. Today, they might not see those same people, because a lot of times in these parish, the Spanish Mass is at one time, the Vietnamese Mass is at another time, and the English Mass or Masses at other times. They don't always see each other, but they are aware that they are in the same parish. So the very fabric of parish life is changing, for good or for ill, by the presence of many newcomers, not all of whom are Latino, but many of whom are. One of the big dynamics in pastoral life now is how do people minister within these parishes? What's the best way to provide leadership? The national parishes, the ones that served the Irish and the Italians before, were actually, in my mind, one of the best pastoral strategies developed in this country. Sometimes this happened by mere circumstance, but there was a conscious strategy in many instances as well. And what those parishes did is they enabled newcomers, immigrants, and their children and grandchildren to integrate from a position of strength. I'm not a sociologist, but Bill was my professor, so I got a little of this sociology stuff down. They integrated from a position of strength over generations and through Catholic parochial schools and through having a place, a parish where they felt they belonged in this country. People were able to integrate. Loyola University is a clear sign of this. Here you have a university that was founded to serve immigrant groups, and many of them are now the most successful people in Chicago because the Catholic Church, the parish, in this case also the university, allowed folks over generations to integrate from a position of strength. I think the challenge of these shared parishes is how do we duplicate those same dynamics today? There's often a pressure. Why don't these people speak English yet? By having masses in different languages, we're simply reinforcing the segregation. You know, why don't we all come together as one body of Christ? But too often when that's said, what it really means is let's be one body of Christ. They should learn our language. They should adopt our customs. They should do what we do. And the unity is not based on Christ, it's based on some kind of cultural uniformity. And we forget, being Irish and Croatian myself, our own ancestors had 3 generations to do this. We want new arrivals to do it in 15 days. So sometimes the parishes, there can be sorts of tensions because there may be what looks like 2 faith communities under one roof in one parish church. I think that kind of, the difficulty of working through that can be very healthy. Because in fact, what people most want from the church is not to learn English or even to be integrated. They want to be fed in their faith. And they want to have a sense of belonging. Because without that, it doesn't feel like the church. If you don't feel like you belong, if you feel like you're being forced into something or made to integrate, it doesn't feel like the church. What often happens, of course, is people vote with their feet. We're losing lots of Latinos for various reasons. But some just don't find the parish to be a welcoming place, a place where they feel at home. Now those words, by the way, are also important words to me. The difference between hospitality and homecoming. You heard that word here, and we use it a lot. I use it myself. The importance of making people feel welcome at the parish. Well, that's good, but it's only a first step. Because when you say to someone, welcome to the parish, there's kind of presumption of who are the owners of the house and who are the guests in the house. And so this word hospitality can even unintentionally have a kind of a negative connotation. What everybody wants, what those Irish and German and Italian immigrants wanted of yesterday, they didn't want to just feel welcome. They wanted to feel at home. And they did, because the church was often theirs, with a priest and sister, women religious of their own background. So the challenge is when folks come into a parish that really has been built by another group that already exists, how does that sense of welcoming become a sense of belonging? How do we move from hospitality to homecoming? And it's not surprising to find that where these parishes exist, what the newcomers will do, be they Latinx people or Asian or African groups, what they will do is they will go to a mass, a pious society, a catechism program, a prayer group, a Bible study, where they do feel at home. They are, in fact, whether they're aware of it or not, they're recreating the national parish of yesteryear. Instead of having a separate parish, they go to the structures within the existing parish that meet their needs, that allow them to feel at home. Now, I can't say much more about this because of a lack of time, but there's many, many more points to make about how this happens and how it can happen best. But here's the final point on this first set of observations. Many people are nervous to talk about the thing I'm talking about now, because there are difficulties in parishes. Sometimes there's even ethnic and racial kind of conflicts between people. And it makes us feel like, oh my God, if we don't fix this now, we are a racist parish. And there is racism in Catholics, there is racism in parishes. But the point is this, I think, we don't do anything in the parish to the point that we would all be satisfied. If you ask most pastors, how is the youth ministry in your parish? Very few of them are going to tell you, oh, it's going great, we have nothing else to do. Even if things are going well, they're saying, you know, we got some things going on, things are better, we got a long way to go. How's the evangelization in your parish? Well, you know, we're Catholics. We didn't even use that word a few years ago, and some of us, we still can't quite have it roll off our tongues without fumbling it a bit. But we've made some things, we got some programs going on, and we're working on it. Anything you ask, most honest pastors are going to tell you, we're on the way, but we're not there yet. But if you ask someone, how are you doing in unity and diversity? Oh, we took care of that problem. Even call it a problem. Unity and diversity, in my mind, what I'm sort of saying today is, it's not a problem. Well, sometimes it's a problem, but it's another aspect of parish life. We are never going to be as united as we should be as Catholics. We've talked about various sources of disunity in these 2 days. So it's not a matter of saying we've now resolved that. It's a matter of saying this year we've grown further than we were last year, and we're not there yet. I always tell my students at Notre Dame, where I teach, I would tell the same thing to first-year students at Loyola. We're trying to make this institution a more diverse institution, but also a still united institution. And we're not going to get there in the 4 years you're here, and we're not going to get here in the rest of the years I have as a faculty member here. But I hope you leave it better than you found it. And so this unity and diversity is the call of the church to be the church. We already have all the unity we could desire if we celebrate the Eucharist together. Unity is a gift from God, but we're not there yet. We've received it as a gift, but we're not living it out fully yet. And the call of the shared parish in a very divided society, I don't even need to mention the immigration rhetoric that goes on in our politics these days, is an opportunity for the Catholic Church to be a faithful witness to what it really means to come together and to try to be one, or to try to come together in unity in the midst of various diversities, including, in this case, ethnic and language ones. The second point, and I'm sorry, I get very fired up and I'm talking longer than I should, but the second point I want to raise, immigration would be a very big one. It's the social justice issue of our day, I think. That's in the book, but I've only got time for two. So I'm going to talk about a different one, which is passing on the faith to Latino young people. I think is a huge concern, not just for Hispanic ministry, it's the concern of the entire Catholic Church. Think of this. This is, to me, another important statistic. We already got some from Heidi. In the next 30 years, the number of second-generation children of immigrants, Latinos in this country, is going to double. And the number of third-generation grandchildren of immigrants is going to triple. The percentage of Latinos that are immigrants is actually going to go down. Maybe not the overall number, but the percentage is going to, because there's going to be so many children and grandchildren of immigrants. This is the most massive demographic transition from first to second to third generation of any language cultural group in the history of the United States, including the Irish. This is going to transform every aspect of life in this country, the workforce, politics, we don't know how, certainly the churches. So we're going through this huge transition, and we've talked about young people, and looking forward to hearing them in a moment at lunch. Most of the young people in the Catholic Church now are already Latino, and a difference between them and many of their peers is they still have in their families the living memory of immigration. People like my Irish family, we kind of know we were immigrants, but none of the immigrants are still alive. That goes back too many generations. These children of immigrants and grandchildren of immigrants, they are still living in that dynamic. And that just complicates things all the more because they have the world of their immigrant parents and grandparents and then the world of their peers. And they're caught in between those two. And very often that can be a very, just powerful and strong dynamic that just complicates their lives even more. Well, I have so many other things I would like to say about that, but let me end with this. A lot of ministry among Latinos is geared towards immigrants. In fact, I think there's kind of a lack. We often think Hispanic ministry equals Spanish language ministry, and that's only part of it. Part of the ministry is to younger people who may or may not speak Spanish or be bilingual. They may speak both languages, or they may speak only English. And yet they've still got enough of that cultural background that just being in kind of an English-speaking group that's not geared towards their reality, their lives doesn't appeal. And so a lot of the ministry has been focused on the culture of Latinos. So you have a big Guadalupe Mass at the parish, and lots of immigrants come, and they feel very connected to that. And it's a beautiful thing to do. And in Mexico or in other countries of Latin America, that kind of ministry would be very effective. But young people, they're living in a religious culture of choice, as we've been talking about. Their parents, maybe not so much, even though they're here, they still had their formation as young people back home. But the young people, a cultural Catholicism usually doesn't carry the day. It does for some. As Pope Francis keeps reminding us, they need a personal encounter, like we all do, with Jesus Christ. Not just a Catholicism of culture, but a Catholicism of commitment. How does one, through a retreat movement, through being in campus ministry at a place like Loyola, through a parish, a youth group, through the many other ways that youth minister to themselves, how do they not just have this sense of I'm a cultural Catholic because I'm Mexican or I'm Venezuelan or I'm Puerto Rican, but a real chance to encounter? And, in the 1950s, half of the Catholic children in this country who were in school were in parochial schools. Only 3% of Latinos are in parochial schools. That was one of the main ways we passed on the faith to people of my generation and the generation right around my time. Now the challenge is greater than ever. And really, it's not just a challenge for Hispanic parents or those who work in parishes with large Latino populations or the campus ministry at places like Notre Dame and Loyola. It's a challenge for the entire church, because these are our young people. And the way we enable them to evangelize one another or work with one another or find the meaning of faith in their lives literally is the barometer of what the church is going to be in next year and the year after, and certainly by the year 2050, because those are the young people who are before us. Thank you very much.
Hear me? Oh, there we go. So I'll just give 2 minutes of my reflection on what I've heard from these three great panelists. And then I'd love to go out and hear some questions and comments with the reminder, as we said previously, this is not your chance to make a speech, but to ask a question or make a very brief comment. So I noticed a thread about liturgy and parish attachment and involvement from all three speakers. And, where we do Catholicism is at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning. These shared parishes that sometimes are in conflict or parallel. Liturgically, how we have the reforms of Vatican II have taken root, and the question about whether choice around a liturgical participation is constitutive of what it means to be Catholic or not. And it makes me think about how so much demographic statistics and data and analysis, which we journalists love, so I'd love to have a stat in my story that can substantiate what I'm trying to illustrate. Often, Catholics say this, Catholics think that, Catholics are doing such and such, and what defines who gets to even be in the survey? And often mass attendance, so regular mass goers, people who want to know, that's what I want to know what those people think, not just people who identify as Catholic. So how important is parish attachment, mass going, participation in sacraments, especially when we have such large numbers of young people who are not doing that? I'm thinking of the survey that St. Mary's Press did this about a year ago with the ominous title, Going, Going, Gone, about young people, sort of tried to look at the nuns and why do they leave and what do they think. And, so sometimes it's not the reasons we think. And for many of them, it was because they thought the church wasn't helping them have that experience of Jesus and that connection. So I'd like to hear some of your questions. I have some follow-up questions myself, but let's go to we're going to go to the audience. I can walk around like Oprah here. So I'd love to hear what some of your comments or questions are. Don't be afraid. Young people, we want to hear from you.
Francis has a pretty healthy theology of the adversary, and in contemplating that, he had a line that always stuck with me, that diversity was a gift of the Holy Spirit, division was from the devil. And it occurred to me as I was listening to your comments, how does that strike your ear?
St. Francis or
Pope Francis.
Pope Francis?
I agree with the Pope. That's a great way to start, isn't it? I do think diversity is a gift of the Holy Spirit, yeah. But it's not an absolute and automatic good. And I think sometimes we in higher education actually can be most guilty of this. We want more diversity, and diversity in and of itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. That's why I think it's important for what he added, which I think the counter of division is of the evil, that unity, true unity, is also a gift of the Holy Spirit. So I think that's where the challenge lies. It's great, but it's just a sociological fact. Our parishes are more diverse linguistically and ethnically than any other religion in the country. But that in and of itself doesn't add up to anything that's worth anything. If we don't work towards the unity that the second part of that statement goes towards, then we can, well, great, we got diversity, so we can check off boxes and say we got this and that and the other thing. The real work of trying to find, to model for the world the beauty, why is that a gift? Because we all are richer because of it. And the unity that we seek and the understanding and so on, that's the hard work that makes that diversity valuable, more valuable.
Bill, you got to move the mic over there.
So again, this is hearkening back to my question about what are our parameters and so forth, and in relationship to the centrality of the Eucharist in the liturgy. So I would argue that the Eucharist ought to be absolutely central to who we are as people of faith, the sacramental sensibility, etc. We, in point of fact, have now these two rites, if you will, the extraordinary rite and so forth. And having probed this for years, I am of a mind that yes, at some theological level, we have to claim that this is the Novus Ordo Missae is the same rite as the Tridentine and so forth. But I'm telling you, they are not phenomenologically. That this is these are forms of worship that convey radically different messages. And in what sense is the Eucharist then unity? Not to mention the fact that you have people using the Tridentine rite for whom this is an explicit ritual repudiation of Vatican II and everything that it represented. Not to thirdly mention the fact that if you look at some of the research on what Catholics actually believe about the Eucharist all over the place.
Andrew, you want to respond to that as well?
I guess I'd have to begin by saying that it's important to mention that I'm not Catholic. And so, what I'm saying is, or what I will say, is to be understood as a sort of interested observer's comment about these things. Bill's challenge is hard to respond to. I think you can make a historical argument that the New Order Mass is, in fact, in line with the Roman Rite in its long historical tradition. I think he's right that it's used polemically in both for and against. I think that the great adjustment of many adjustments that the Catholic Church as an institutional community has to come to terms with is that it has limited power to compel people to do what it wants to do. It just discovered this over and over again throughout history. You could easily read in the Catholic journalism of the 1950s complaints about religious ignorance and theological imprecision. People complaining that or asserting that the Bible is the Word of God and then not being able to name the four evangelists and all that kind of stuff. I think this is in somewhat in continuity. I think most of the polling data suggests that Catholics don't differ that much about the meaning of the Eucharist, at least compared to non-Catholics. And the sort of loose borders are going to be a problem for everyone, but a bigger problem for groups like the Catholics and the Orthodox, and for Orthodox Jews, than they are for some others. There was a time when the Archdiocese of Hartford used to send letters, and it was up until the 1970s, would send letters to people saying, we note that you have moved from St. Lawrence O'Toole Parish to St. Bridget Parish. You're now there. Earlier in this discussion was cited the fact that in many places half the members aren't geographically inside the boundaries of the parish these days. That's just a reality of individual choice. Ultimately, Catholic participation depends on the consent of those participating, and I think that there will be vigorous internal discussion and hierarchical discussion about these sorts of things. But the Church has largely accommodated this reality by letting people shunt themselves into smaller, more coherent, more cohesive groups.
Thank you. Any other, so we don't just have to be questions, people can make comments as well, and I'm going to prioritize young people if there's any young people that want to jump in. Young person.
I had a quick question for Timothy. I know the statistics that you gave, like especially with the Latino population, was really interesting. What do you also have to say about, with what you said, Heidi, like with the lapsed Catholics? Because I know you said that the Latino population and the generations to come are going to be really big in the church in the future, but what do you have to say about those who might not be Latino, but those who are simply lapsed in terms of like what their future is going to look like within the church?
You mean younger Latinos who are lapsed?
Just the left, in general.
That are not Latino? Oh. Well, that phenomenon actually does take place among Latinos as well. I mean, I guess my biggest shock doing this work for almost 40 years now, I never would have predicted 30 years ago that almost 20% of Latinos in this country, and the numbers are stronger among the young people, call themselves no religion to a survey. I don't know what that means. People answer that for different, but Latinos always would have said, I'm Catholic, even if they weren't regular Sunday goers. But in terms of other young people, I think what I said at the end is exactly the same thing. I mean, young people, maybe more so than anyone, but all of us are in this situation, but maybe young people particularly, they have to have a reason to want to do it. And so the same way with Latinos, a culture of Catholicism is not enough. There's going to need that personal encounter, the commitment of Catholicism. That's just absolutely vital for the younger folks. And really, I'm sure it's happening in your campus ministry here. Where it happens, it's usually happening because young people do it. If you look at the whole history of Catholicism in this country, one of the most important pastoral lessons we learned, or we should have learned, is that while everyone can minister to everyone else, priests to their whole congregation, sisters, lay people, it's usually the peer-to-peer ministry that's most effective. When the Italians came here in the 19th century, and there weren't yet a lot of Italian priests and sisters, the ministry floundered until they had Italian sisters to teach Italians. And then the ministry, the church attendants, the people. So I think that same principle of peer-to-peer ministry. So it's young people serving other young people. Gay people. Divorced. It doesn't mean that's exclusive, that only those people can help others to find a deeper understanding of their faith. But where you have peer-to-peer ministry, young people to young people in this case, you have a better chance of really helping someone to that Catholicism of commitment. I don't know if that's getting into your question, but that's what I think about what we should be doing.
Can I chip in?
Oh, who's talking?
I'm Andrew.
Oh, yes, I wanted to say,
Who is that?
God is speaking. That was if other panelists want to comment on that question before we go to the next one, yes.
Do you want, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, this goes to the nuns discussion. At the moment, the nuns discussion based on survey research is an evolution of a change in the way religious identities questions were asked beginning in the late 1990s. It used to be asked, "What's your religion?" question mark. And now it's asked, "What's your religion, if any?" question mark. A phrasing of the question which liberated a lot of people to say they don't have a religion. Many of those people who are saying they don't have a religion don't mean they don't have religious values or elements of religious faith or even of religious practice. It means they don't affiliate themselves with a particular religious institution. And that's the reality at the ground level that religious organizations have to cope with. In contemporary American culture, more people think religious identity questions are wholly personally determined. Not who your grandmother was, not who your tribe is, not what your background is. Individuals get to choose, and so religious groups will, in the broader sense, compete more or less effectively as they come to terms with that reality.
Mm-hmm. Bill, did you want to comment also, or no? Not yet. Okay, one other young person.
Yeah, I'm super fascinated by concepts of polarization in the modern Catholic Church, and I wanted to ask specifically with the Latino community. I mean, we see it in the general body of the Catholic Church in general, but within the subset of Latino Catholics, do you see like a increased polarization and over a variety of issues within that subset?
Thank you.
Sometimes, particularly among those, maybe some of your fellow students here who are more aware and more involved in the kind of the culture discussions and wars that make up life in this country. More broadly, though, I think Latinos are a great gift to the Catholic Church in this country. I think they bring a great sacramental incarnational sense. Certainly, I personally have learned from and become a stronger Catholic because of worshiping with them and being in touch with them and studying and working with them. The internal dynamics of the Catholic Church, the polarizing dynamics that you're asking about, to me, for large part, not exclusively, these come from those of us who are middle class, comfortable in our lives, and we can talk about those things. For immigrants and DACA students and people who are very much closer to that reality of immigration, the church is not about whether we should have this moral teaching or that moral teaching or who should be presiding at liturgy. Not that those things aren't important or that they wouldn't want to have a thought about them, but the church is about, how am I going to survive with my family? What's going to go on with my children? They don't want the church to just be arguing about its internal dynamics. They want a church that's very much what Cardinal said last night, a church that is mission, not just doing mission as kind of one of its sideline activities, but is about mission. And that doesn't mean they're necessarily better than other Catholics. It's just simply where they are. I think that's healthy for the church, though, because I think the reminder is the reason that, we have a church is to carry on the saving work of Christ. So, try to announce that to the world. And for people who are very, very marginal because of their legal status, because of their economic status, because they're working with great poverty to try to raise a family, and that's not just immigrants and it's not just Latinos, but there tend to be more of them in that category. So you don't hear as many conversations. If this was a group of, if we were doing this in Spanish, you wouldn't hear as many conversations about those kinds of points because the daily lived reality is pointing at another purpose and focus of the church. Again, that doesn't mean they're criticizing what the rest of us might be saying, and I'm not criticizing these conversations because they're very, very important. But where they are with the church is just a very different place.
Bill?
Yeah. So I very much think Tim is right on the mark with respect to Latinos, but I'm still somebody who kind of likes to hold on to this liberal, left-right ideal, and part of this is because Robert Wuthnow, a well-known sociologist, pointed out quite a number of years ago that in relationship to American religious behavior, that if you knew something about where a person tended to fall on a left-right continuum in relationship to basic value orientations, that told you far more about where they were religiously, so to speak, than what particular church or denomination they belonged to. And the most recent take-up on that kind of research is Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous Mind. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting social psychological research showing that where people are on these very, very basic value orientations tends more often than not to trump what particular institution you're affiliated and so forth. So I think that, I guess what I'm saying is that part of what's driving this polarization may have to do something with the nature of mind itself. And that is to say, the way we're constituted in terms of our personalities, in terms of our basic value orientations and so forth. And again, if you read The Righteous Mind, you'll see what he's getting at there. So.
We have another question here.
So I know a lot of the studies revolved around the Latino community. However, I'm Polish, and as a young woman in the Polish community, I was just wondering, I attend church, of course, and Polish people are known to be very devoted Catholics, and I noticed that the Polish youth, at least, is very involved in the church, because a lot of, whether it's the Polish school, Polish folk dance groups, they all revolve around that as well. So I was just wondering if, and even like with opportunities such as churches planning trips such as to World Youth Day, the most recent one in Panama a couple years ago in Poland that I had the chance to go to as well. So I was just wondering whether it's like, I guess, the lack of opportunity in other communities or just the way people are raised, in which some cultural backgrounds, such as the Latino community, we see the lack of youth, whereas in Polish, I would say there is like that strong youth in the community.
Tim, you want to start first, maybe?
Okay. Well,
Joe, go
the
ahead.
dynamics you're describing of a really active young group, I mean, that happens with a lot of young Latinos. I'm actually speaking to one tonight of, where they've come together. It doesn't happen to all, and I presume there's not a lot of Polish youth. We got a question here of numbers, I presume there are some that come that don't find that kind of a community. Actually, it's probably more difficult for Polish youth because unless you end up in a place where there are other young, you could be all alone in Kansas somewhere, and you got to learn English because none of your friends are going to know. So the dynamics you are describing of people being deeply committed to the church and their faith and having a group that's very, very active, that happens in a lot of places, just not all of them and not enough of them, really. But a lot of times, without Spanish-speaking priests, the young people start these groups on their own because they're so desirous to have that connection and that way to nurture their own faith that you're talking about. So that dynamic does take place. It's just, it needs to be multiplied more and more. I'm glad to hear that you're doing all the things that you're doing. Very beautiful. Thank you.
Andrew, you want to jump in?
Can I?
Yes.
Okay, I guess I want to stress that communities are not an interchangeable commodity. They're not all the same. They don't function the same. They change at different rates over time. And I'd say for lots of reasons, Polish identity in places where there are lots of Poles and recent Polish immigrants is a pretty strong thing. However, I am reminded of a conversation I had 2 years ago sitting in the parlor of the Lithuanian Catholic Church in Hartford with a bunch of elderly ladies who wanted to talk with me with great intensity about the crisis of intermarriage in Hartford in the 1940s, by which they meant the trouble they had with their parents when they wanted to marry Polish-American boyfriends. So that's sort of gone in places like this. Those divisions and sharp communal lines go away. The Poles, as a generalization, seem to have been like being Polish and to be pretty good at keeping it going. And they may continue to do so under these circumstances if young Poles choose to do that. The trick is getting young Poles to continue choosing to do that, or young Latinos, or young Franco-Americans, or young down.
I'd like to bring the kind of two roles of gender and generation to the panel here. So for someone like myself, an aging baby boomer who was really brought up in many ways in the pre-Vatican II church and then came to maturity in the Vatican II church, there was a sense of hopefulness and a sense of confidence that things would change for women. But, I mean, I was one of the people when I graduated from college, I had to take a typing test in order to get a job. I mean, fortunately, that doesn't happen anymore. So I think that there has been a sense of enculturation among people of my age and maybe down another 20 years or so. But the young people that I have in classes now, they have seen a different way of living for women. And they don't have the same culture, they don't have the same sense of, well, there's all this good stuff going on in the church that I'm kind of willing to hang in there for. And so in 40 years of teaching courses on women and religion, my women students, they don't see a future for themselves in the church. And they don't have the kind of the background that I've had, and maybe even people 20 years younger. And they just, the exclusion of women from ordained ministry makes absolutely no sense, as it does to me too, but I've been hanging in there longer. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this kind of joining of gender and generation and what that does, because as we all know, a lot of faith formation takes place in the family, and women have a lot to do with that. And so I think some of the nuns and some of the emerging women who are coming into their 20s and 30s, they don't see the same kind of hopefulness that I think others have.
Guess I'll let the three men respond to that question. Maybe I'll comment after they're done, or whoever wants to comment.
Yeah, no, I could just say, I mean, on a personal note, and as a father of 3 daughters who are grown women, have their own families, that they struggle mightily with sexual apartheid at the altar. So I just state that reality in my own personal life. And this is, I think, something, Patricia, that I think you were the one that mentioned this last night, but again, if you look at the data, women have traditionally, by the kind of measures we use of religiosity, frequency of prayer, more likely to be devout, more likely to be Orthodox, mass attendance, etc., there has always been a significant between, that is to say, women more religious, if you will, by these kinds of measures. And this is what's happening, where there were, I mean, the more recent CARA data shows there's virtually no difference now between men and women in terms of intensity of religiosity and so forth. And this is going to have serious, serious consequences down the road, given the oftentimes preeminent role of women in the religious socialization of children. I mean, this is going to have serious consequences. Do we really want to continue alienating women?
Do either of you want to comment on that topic?
I think the situation you're describing is the real situation. And again, it's, you know, Bill's example is, it's his daughter's choices, or your students' choices as individuals, that will determine how things go. And if there's a massive structural obstacle in which women don't feel equal, that will make it more difficult for Catholics to prosper.
Any comments, Tim?
All I would say about young Latinas is, you know, as I described, in some of these dynamics of more recent immigrants, they're not quite at the same point. Not some are, but not all. You know, there's a lot of leadership in youth groups, and of course, Latinas have long been, as is true in other groups as well, the faith leaders in their families and so on. So they're exercising another kind of leadership apart from the ordination question. But I hope I've made it clear in various things that I said today. As generations are here longer, they're much more influenced by what happens here, what they hear from people in the church here, professors, peers especially, of course. So sometimes Latinos are presented as if they're kind of preternaturally like their immigrant forebears. Of course, that's just not true. Our Irish immigrants are very different than we are now. We're very different, and this is already happening and will happen more and more the longer those families are here, and the memory of where they've come from is less a living memory. So the things that you're describing already happen with many Latinas and will probably happen with more and more over time.
Any young women want to comment? Are you raising your hand? Oh, but you can ask a question too, that'd be great.
So my background, I'm Mollenkirk Catholic, so it's a very new church within America. So a lot of the struggles that we're seeing right now is that much of our church attendance is for social and cultural growth and less of liturgical. So as a young leader in the church, one of the questions that we're faced with is, where will we see our church in 20 years? Is it viable? And I guess my question is, because a lot of immigrant Catholics have already gone through this process right there towards the end. We're at the beginning of it. So if you have any tips or any suggestions for me personally to take back to my own church, just because we are faced with this concern, is this viable for us in America as Mollenkirk Catholics? Because a lot of our young church attendees are actually leaving the Mollenkirk Catholic Church specifically because they don't feel a sense of community with their American culture along with their Indian heritage.
Thank you. Panelists? Any good insights into that?
So, for all American religious organizations strongly tied to particular ethno or cultural identities, this is going to be a big problem, and maybe the problem, because those identities evolve and new patterns grow. I myself am Greek Orthodox. We have exactly the same discussion as Mollenkirk Catholics do. The answer is some people are going to go away and some people are going to come in. In the Orthodox world, it's about a wash at the moment. But my suspicion is that the Orthodox Church in America will be a less and less, quote, ethnic, unquote, venture as time goes forward. And it will survive, you will survive, everything survives in America. Maybe just not as happily as the inmates would like.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So again, this is something obvious, I would assume, to most of us, particularly with regard to Euro-American Catholics, and that is that for a very long time, over generations, Catholicism, or being Catholic, was inextricably bound up with ethnicity, which created a very complex social ecology. And to the degree that the great forge of American assimilation has played itself out, we're in a circumstance now in which, again, at least for Euro-American Catholics, Catholicism can't stand on that ethnic game anymore. It can do that by way of nostalgia and what have you, but that ethnic subculture is not there. So then this begs the question, what then helps build the faith and so forth? The other thing that I would raise is the question of trying to think through this relationship between religion and ethnicity, and suggesting that there may be instances, times, moments, circumstances, people for whom those things are conflated in such a way that the religious part of it, how should I say this, is really de facto a kind of subcategory of the ethnicity. In other words, the religious symbols, rituals, whatever their, if you will, theological meaning or what have you, is secondary to their ethnic reality, to their ethnic signification. And that's necessarily, again, in my mind, a somewhat problematic phenomena.
I would only add, and I hope this gives you hope and not feel more responsibility, but in the Latino young folks, probably the greatest need is young people who can be bridges between the parents who are very convicted that we got to keep the language and we got to do it the way we always did it in India or else it's not going to be right, and the young people who are just living in a different world and trying to figure out, well, what, am I going to do this? Am I not going to do that? Like Andrew and Bill have said. A young person who's very convicted of that ethnic identity and treasures it and treasures their ancestors and where they've come from, but also knows what's going on with the youth and can build bridges between those two. It's the most valuable need we have in those ministries right now. It happens in Spanish-speaking communities all over the place because the adults just don't always understand what the children are doing. They think it's all bad. And the children think the adults just don't know what they're talking about. And so a young person who can be a credible witness is a great gift to the community and to the church. So I'm sensing you might be that kind of a person. If you are, God bless you in what you're doing.
So I'd also follow that up with what may sound like a flippant response, which is that many, many groups are now relying on things like summer camp for kids to provide intense experiences of whatever their particular religious version of things is. Among Orthodox Christians in the United States, compared to 20 years ago, camping in which a kind of temporary, intense community of Orthodox people is created, because we live in a world unlike the Catholic one where there aren't very many of us, and we're thinly scattered, is what people are increasingly counting on. You've got to find ways to make manifest the many benefits of being in a religious group, which one of the questioners alluded to a minute or two ago, and that's the sort of thing that people are trying now, to try to create intense bonds with traditions and identity. Whether it'll work entirely, I doubt, but judging from the experience of my daughters, it's pretty impressive compared to, say, Sunday school.
Okay, Bill, you
Yeah, I
can,
just
30 seconds.
I throw Hanson's law at you. That is
Right.
to say, what the son or daughter wishes to forget, the grandson or the granddaughter wishes to remember.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to keep on time. No, we have 1 minute. Yes. You are in charge.
Yeah, hierarchy. Hierarchy means sacred arrangement, and let's go with the inverted pyramid there. Thank you. I have a high church catechesis about the sacrament of matrimony, unitive, procreative, and for the education of children. When I was a kid, it seemed to me, and I'm a Gen Xer, and this came up, but that kind of the Vatican II wave that was reacting to this pre-conciliar church that opened the windows, there was a lot of freshness in it too, but a lot of folks my age too were a little bit, as they got older and they grew up, they said, well, I don't know if I accept all that. But most of my peers, their parents began to offload their education to other cultural forces. And so when I kind of grow up and look around today, a lot of my friends are unchurched, or if they do, they're doing it dutifully because that's what they know. So I just hear in this conversation, are we going to have to resort to having all our kids go to camp? Like, how much liberty learning about, growing in women's empowerment. I have 2 daughters. And, having the dialogue with the church as we walk forward, rather than saying, go find out for yourself, So there's something about, like, educating as a parent or as in a mentor or apprentice way. Do we throw that away now, or is there a healthier way for us to kind of like navigate choice, which is operative here? People are choosing or they're walking. But how do we teach them how to choose in a more nurturing way? And I know that's an almost an unanswerable question, but that's what I was thinking of.
Well, as the mother of 2 smaller children, my kids are 10 and 11, I would say not just educating, but faith sharing. So just sharing your own personal story of faith, and putting them around other people for whom faith has been part of their lives. Because I didn't take Latin growing up, which affected my SAT score, but I had to look up what the title of our program is, and it's Where Are We Going? Where are we marching? Where are we going in the future? And I know we didn't answer all those questions here, but we sure got a great snapshot of where we are, and I'm really looking forward to this afternoon and lunch where we can hear more about where we're going. So thank you so much.